Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks!
Hi, I'm Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, coming to us from Phoenix, Arizona, is Robin Wayland. She is a retired nurse, and I've known her for a couple years now, but she's got some pretty awesome experiences to share about death, dying, and also living. So, Robin, welcome. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for listening to the show. And we know each other through a mutual writing group, but over the years, I've gotten to know you better than that. And the first thing I wanted to explore about your life is your career as a nurse, because I know that that's in the healthcare field and that has a lot to do. So before we jump into that, I always ask our guests three standard questions, which is, how old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation do you consider yourself from, if any?
Oh, okay. Let's see. In that order, I will be 70 this November. I grew up in Connecticut. Initially for the first 8 years in mid-Connecticut, a spot called Litchfield, which is very quaint, very beautiful, clapboard houses on the green, all of that. And then my folks moved to the shore, so I then grew up in a shore town community that my father knew very well because he had grown up near there. So everything was very, very familiar to him. So I grew up sailing and around boats and everything else. And let's see. I'm a boomer. I am a baby boomer. There's no two ways about that. I was born in 1951. And so I do remember very vividly stories of my folks going through what it was like in the war and how they had food ration coupons and so on and so forth. My father didn't serve because he was too young at the time, but he was of age for Korea and got out of that, and I can't remember how or why, but he was Navy, my grandfather was Navy, and everybody before him was Navy.
Cool, very cool. And that's all very interesting, and it helps make sense because you're an author and you're also a poet, which means you're a writer, but you specifically, I know those two mediums for you. And your poetry really speaks about your experiences growing up on the East Coast and with sailing, and it also speaks about nursing and your relationships. So next on my agenda, and feel free to skip around whatever you want, I would like to get into your career as a nurse. Basically just the highlights, meaning like, how did you become one? Why did you become one? And then I'll start asking you questions.
Okay. I grew up wanting to be a doctor. And when I graduated from high school, they just were not taking women into the medical field. Maybe 1% of women graduated from medical school, but that was rare. So it was an uphill struggle, and I was not the sterling student that medical schools would have taken. So I graduated from school with a BA in my BA in languages, which was easy for me. That was something that just came to me. Languages and education, so I could teach, but hated teaching. So then after 3 kids were born, went back into nursing and got my nursing degree and passed the NCLEX and started at the VA. Actually, I take that back. I started for a year and a half because it was very difficult to get a job when I graduated from nursing school. And so the only job I could find was at a nursing home. So I worked there for a year and a half until the VA finally took me. And so that was in Denver in, 1983, I think it was, when I got my nursing license. That gives you perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I didn't know you were a teacher. That's really interesting. So I guess because this is a podcast about dying, I'm going to kind of start asking the morbid questions. First of all, before you were a nurse, had you ever experienced anyone dying? Not meaning had someone in your life died, but had you seen someone die?
I'd never seen anybody physically die in front of me. I was never there for the last parts and pieces of the agonal response to dying. So no, it wasn't until I became a nurse that I actually saw somebody die right in front of me.
And do you want to? I'm curious. What was your first experience with that like? Do you remember it?
Yeah, I do, vividly. This is when I was working in the nursing home, and it was this little frail little old lady. She was like 90 something years old, and she had just been discharged from a local hospital with pneumonia and came to our facility for the 2 or 3 weeks, sort of, they call it rehab, but we weren't rehabbing anybody. And she couldn't go home because she couldn't take care of herself. So I remember one of the aides came to me and said, her first name is Velma, but she doesn't look too good, which is never a great sign. So I went running in there, and certainly she did not look well at all. And I can't even remember if she was breathing, but if she was, it was totally agonal. There was a faint pulse, and I remember thinking, we don't have a code status on this woman. So at that time in nursing homes, because we didn't have a doctor on premise, if you were not a no code, we had to do CPR. So this was the first person I'd ever done CPR on, other than a waxen dummy. And I remember doing, that's sort of when all the teaching comes in and you go into this autopilot. And I remember measuring down on this woman's frail rib cage and putting my fist on her rib cage and doing the first boom, first compression, which broke her sternum. And I was horrified. I was absolutely horrified. But I couldn't stop until the paramedics came, which could be 10, 15, 20 minutes. So I'm sitting there doing CPR thinking, what the hell? I mean, what am I doing? I'm not saving this woman's life. I'm destroying the dying embers of this woman's life. Then in those days, too, we did mouth to mouth. And so I remember thinking, she has pneumonia. Oh, my God. And I put my mouth on hers and gave 2 breaths, watching as her chest rose. And my hand was on her chest, so I could feel as her lungs would inflate, thinking, am I just blowing air into her pulmonary tree? Because I could have, cracked her. I know I broke her sternum, and her ribs are sort of flailing away. And what am I creating holes in her lungs? Because when you think the lungs as being balloons within balloons, if you break those with ribs, which is not hard to do, then you're just blowing into the chest cavity. And it was blissfully, the paramedics came and sort of looked at me and looked at her and realized, this woman is dead. There's nothing we could do. But the protocol at that time said that they had to haul her off to the hospital. And I got a call the next day as I was at work trying to sort of sort this out in my head. And I can't remember who it was, whether it was a social worker or whatever, but I remember getting fussed at for sending this person to the hospital. And I remember thinking, there has got to be a better way to do this, because this was horrible. And then I had to call the sister, who was 90 some odd years old, and explain to her that her sister died. And that was just awful. And of course, she came in and wanted to get her sister's things. And it was just, I mean, in my mind, I can remember going through all of the things she had in her bedside table. And the one thing we didn't have was her teeth. And they needed them. I found this out for the mortuary. And heaven only knows where those teeth are. But anyway, that was my first experience with death, and why I didn't just
Wow.
quit right then and there is beyond me.
Yeah, no, that's pretty heavy, and it really entailed all of the things about dying too, like with the actual process, the trying to save the life, telling people. So did it get easier after that? Did it always stay kind of hard?
It's always hard. It's always hard. But you know, and then I was married twice. Both husbands died of cancer. And that put a whole different light on things. That made it personal. And up until my first husband died, death was something that happened to other people that I took care of. When my first husband died, death became personal. Now, yes, I had had other people die in my life. My mother had died at an early age. All of my grandparents had died. My great-grandmother, whom I knew and loved dearly. But that was separate because they didn't die in front of me. But when my first husband died, this was the first time a loved one, dearly loved one, was dying in front of me. And we had already established that he said he didn't want tubes, he didn't want this, he didn't want any of that. So I said, okay, fine.
And this is just real quick for our audience. This is the father of your 3 children, correct?
Yes. And we were in Virginia. I was working for the Navy at that point. And we had this wonderful house on stilts, my favorite house in the world. But I remember, I remember my daughter coming in saying, Mom, you've got to do something. He's dying. And I said, I know he's dying. I know he is. We're going to keep him comfortable. That's the most we can do. And so I sort of worked as well as I could through all of that. Not only were the kids there in various stages, but also his mother was there. And this was the last of her 5 kids that she was to see die. And she wasn't handling it particularly well either. But, I mean, what's good and what's bad in these circumstances? Heaven knows, I certainly don't know. But anyway, after that became personal. And death was no longer something that happened to people. It was something that happened, it was going to happen to all of us. But it was more of a personal fight. And that's when the Navy contacted me and said, hey, this was actually Balboa, and said, hey, we have an opening for a GS, whatever it was, 12 position in San Diego. Are you interested? And I thought, I was doing cardiology then, all the cardiology tests and everything. And loving my job. I had worked, 10-hour days, perfect. Had the most wonderful house in the world, but decided, yes, I'm going to go to California. I'm going to change everything that I do. I'm going to sort of reset everything. It's like doing, it's sort of like defibrillating your life. Because you're resetting everything, what you do, where you are, where you live, everything. So I packed up the house, packed up the car, got in. A week later, I was in San Diego, reinventing me and trying to get through the sort of ashes of what remained of my understanding of how, my first husband died and all of the sort of the remnants of that.
And real quick, were your 3 children already out of the house when you moved to San Diego?
Oh yeah. They were all grown and gone. Yeah, and I had my granddaughter with me, actually, who was 8, 10, something like that. So she had to witness this too. And it was really hard because afterwards I was just phenomenally depressed, and surprisingly so. And so San Diego was sort of this new move, and it was going to be, it was essential for my Navy career because I needed 5 years in California as the top 5 anyway before I retired. So anyway, that was sort of the thinking of it all.
I'm glad I actually know you personally because I don't feel bad asking this question, but it's a very hard question for me to ask a normal person. As someone who's very happily married, you know, the thought of my wife passing away at any stage is incredibly depressing. Can you explain not the depression, but like, what did you tell yourself? Like, how did you wake up? How did you go on? I mean, I know tons of people lose people, but I want to hear how you did it.
Oh, yeah. I remember the intern. I remember when I took JD into the hospital. This was actually, it was early on in our move to Virginia from Denver. He was complaining of hip pain and things like that. So we took him to the VA, and I was thinking they were going to say arthritis. The intern, whom I knew from his rotations, I knew him professionally as a nurse, he pulled me aside and he said, I hate to tell you this, but your husband's got multiple myeloma. And that is not the diagnosis you want to hear as a nurse, as an oncology nurse, because all I remember with myeloma is my patients complaining of pain, pain, pain. So he said, this is going to be a long haul and it's going to be hard. And he said, we'll get him straight on all the medications he needs and hooked into an oncologist, but he's not going to be eligible for bone marrow transplant. So it's just going to be a long haul for you. And he said, let us know if you need time off or anything like that. So me, in the typical sort of nurse framework, I said, well, okay, I need to contact the kids and make sure. He had kids from outside marriages or other marriages. So I wanted to make sure all the kids had a chance to come and spend some time, quality time with him. So we arranged that. I remember saying to JD, I sat down one day and I said, okay, this diagnosis is not a happy one. There's going to be pain. And we had sat down with the oncologist and all the other medical leads, but this was a time where it's just me and JD. And I said, what do you want from all of this? What is it that you want? And he said, you know, I want time with you and I want time with my kids. I want time. And I said, well, okay, I'm going to make it as painless as possible. But I said, you know, there's going to be times your mother's going to want you to come to Rocky Mount, North Carolina, you know, be with her and all of that. And he said, no, I am not going to the hospital. I'm not having tubes in my body. I'm not going out like a sucker. He said, I want you. You've been with me through all of this. I want you in my bed the way you always have been. And I said, okay, that's the way it is. And that's the way it was. I mean, I remember the very last day, there was one time, this is kind of funny. My mother-in-law she wanted to encamp right in our bedroom. And JD said, no, absolutely not. No, there's going to be some separation here. You go sleep elsewhere. And we had ample rooms in that house, so that wasn't a deal breaker. But we were able to put a hospital bed in the, it was this sort of, technically it's a porch, but it's enclosed and it had saltillo tile down. So it was the one room that could really hold a hospital bed. So JD and I slept together in that hospital bed because he insisted he wanted to feel me next to him at night. That was how he felt secure. And unfortunately, with all of the medications we had to give him, he had a lot of nightmares and sort of vivid recall from Vietnam and Korea and all the rest of it. But he always was sort of calmed by feeling my body next to his. So right up until the day he died. That's the way it was. And I know my mother-in-law was livid. She was like, no, but I said, oh, this is the way JD wants it, and this is the way it's going to be.
Well, I love that. So what do you, spiritually speaking, metaphysically speaking, do you believe anything happens when we die? I mean, what do you think actually happens?
Yes, I do. And since then, at that point, I became a little bit more attuned metaphysically to what happens during that process, because I've never believed that energy just disappears. And I've always thought, and I still think this, and since when I went on to, teach young nurses and corpsmen about how to take care of the dead, the dying, and how to take care of people at the point of death and after death and all of this kind of stuff. I always felt that, all of the energy that the heart has, that the brain has, all of that electrical energy, we're taught in science that it doesn't disappear. Energy just doesn't cease to exist. And I think somehow, as the body dies, a lot of the internal systems go sort of slow down too. We know that the GI system slows down, but the heart's a different animal. The heart's electricity. It's really interesting, because we've seen in patients that are dying a perfectly good sinus rhythm, and they'll be pulseless. They'll be absolutely dead, but they'll have a perfectly good sinus rhythm. So what is up with that, Where does that electricity go? And also I've seen the inverse, where and this is more often the case, where you'll have this phenomenal energy. It'll be a VTAC, VFib, and then sort of dwindling down to nothing. But then right after that, there is this period of, I just don't know how to describe it, but it's this period where everybody is very, very quiet in the room, including staff, doctors, whomever, and loved ones, where it's just this period of silence. It's kind of like, I liken it to before meals. My grandmother, who was Quaker, would always say, may we have a moment of silence. And that was the Quaker way of prayer. It reminds me of that moment of silence. And it's this highly spiritual energy that you feel in the room, whether it's exiting the room, whether it's walking out by elevator, by escalator, who knows, but you do feel it. And people that are sensitized to it feel it too. So, and then of course, you go on with whatever your spiritual dictates are. For me, it was always teaching the corpsmen to use rose water and things like that to wash the body, and to treat the body, the person, with reverence, whatever your reverence would be, but to treat that person who, even though they no longer have a beating heart, there's still a person, there's still that energy that's exiting the body. And so that requires profound kind of gentle touch. But that took me 20 years.
Yeah, no. That was very profound. Do you think that energy includes our consciousness, or do you think it's a different thing?
No, having seen a dying heart, literally having seen hearts, because, in the ICU, you're all hooked up to monitors. And a lot of times we'll turn off the sound on the monitors, but we'll watch the monitors in another room so that we can tell when we need to go in. That's just a very practical element that just about every ICU nurse does, because you don't want to come upon a body like you do at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they've been dead for God only knows how long. And you think, oh my goodness, they died all by themselves. Well, yes, most people do die all by themselves. Death is it's a process that is solo. No, we don't generally haul people along with it. But so, you kind of watch as the heart kind of dwindles down, and the energy, the amplitude electrically in that myocardium goes down too in certain cases. And that's got to be the same with the brain. I've only once or twice had the EEGs hooked up. And again, it's that same kind of activity that sort of subliminally winds down as the body winds down. It's very curious. I mean, from a totally clinical standpoint, but it's also highly profound. It's very profound, and it makes you take, at least it makes me take a step back as just sort of a human being and a mother and a wife and a this and a that, and a nurse. It kind of makes you step back and think, wow, I've seen babies born into the world, and it's that same kind of profound, wow, that, it kind of grips you, but kind of in reverse, if you can imagine that.
That's really well said. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We're not out of it. So I do want to ask you to kind of share personally for yourself, how do you feel about your own mortality and your own death? How would you like it to happen? Do you think about that?
I do. I'm 70. The better part of my life is behind me rather than in front of me. And at this point, I look at how, obviously I look at very practical things like advanced directives, and I know exactly what I do and don't want. And it's not that I'm like, what Reza wanted or what JD wanted. I don't want a whole lot of intervention in my death. I want some comfort. And I kind of have a sense that I probably will live to be a fairly ripe old age if genetics has any predicting qualities to it. So my grandparents lived to be almost 100, and they were fairly spry, all things considered. So that probably will be my trajectory. I don't want to die in a hospital unless, well, there's a couple of caveats to that. If I'm going to bleed out, I want to bleed out in a hospital. If I'm going to throw up, I'm going to throw up in a hospital, because that means I'm not staining the house, because that's important for me. I saw how the house was stained when my first husband died, and I no longer wanted to live in it. I don't want to do that to my kids. It's pretty horrific to see. So I just sort of kind of like Reza, my second husband, sort of closed his eyes, and that was that at 8 o'clock one morning, and he just didn't open them again. And so that seems to be a pretty good way of how I'd like to go. And I think most nurses and people in the profession look at that and say, yeah, that's it. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a plane that's, coming down the skies, just sort of quietly and peacefully, just not wake up.
That's so incredible. And that's so beautiful. We're pretty much out of time. I do like to let guests kind of have the floor at the end. So if there's any message you would like to tell people, either specific or unspecifically related to death, dying, what you've learned, please go ahead and tell us.
I think death is not for me, for my practical experience. It's not something to fear. It's something to prepare for when you have the option to prepare. It's something to look at and say, I want this, I don't want that. I was very, very diligent in my advanced directives by saying, I do not want a feeding tube. I don't want a feeding tube down my nose. I don't want a feeding tube in my stomach. If I can't enjoy food, that's it. And besides, I know practically that when you try to feed a stomach that's dying, you have bad results. So that's just practical elements. But I don't want to be force fed. I don't want to be force ventilated. I don't want anyone to mash on my heart and break my ribs the way I did some poor lady. So it's sort of, I want to have all my faculties, and then when the time comes, the time comes. Bang, that's it, I don't want any artificial means of keeping me alive the way physicians think alive is. And we all know it ain't alive. There's no living when you're on a ventilator. That's just existence, and that's not for me. But I'm not afraid of those elements. It doesn't scare me. I'm almost sort of like another chapter, another adventure. And because, I love to read, it is another chapter. You turn the page and voila, there it is. But it's just not yet written. So that's sort of the way I like to look at it all.
Well, that is beautiful and profound, and so is this interview. And I actually get a strong feeling, Robin, that you will definitely be around another 25, 30 years.
Oh, God.
So I will get the pleasure of knowing you for all those. Well, you said 100, and you said you're turning 70. So I appreciate everything you said. It was very eloquent and well said, and you helped us put another nail in the coffin. And again, for our listeners at home, if you could take a second to please review the podcast online and like us and find us on Facebook and all that good stuff. We'd really appreciate it. We're trying to grow. My name is Mike Oppenheim. You have been listening to Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.